Hello and welcome to my YouTube. This YouTube is when were the common things in our lives first introduced? We just take it for granted that the things around us, the things in our homes have always been here, right? No, not really. So let's get started. I used to wear glasses. When were those invented? The first pair of eyeglasses are believed to have been created in Italy between 1268 and 1300, almost 800 years ago. We have 4 TVs scattered throughout our home, and each TV has a wireless remote control. When was the first TV remote control introduced? The first remote control for a TV was introduced in 1950 by Zenith, but it had a wire attached to the TV, and you could turn it on, turn it off, change the volume, change the channels, and it was called the Zenith Lazy Bones. I recently started wearing hearing aids. When were they invented? Electric hearing aids were invented in 1898 by Miller Reese Hutchinson. These used a microphone and battery to amplify sound. Can you imagine lugging something like this around? I mean, my hearing aids are, not even an inch long. Most people have no idea that I'm even wearing them. I can't imagine lugging up a device like this. Probably it's attached to my hip. I drive a hybrid car. When was the first electric car invented? Everybody makes a big deal about electric cars. The first electric car is the 1888 Flocker Electrowagen built by Andre Flocken in Germany. It was a four-wheel vehicle. It had 1 horsepower electric motor, which was powered by a rechargeable battery. Amazing. Had no idea they had rechargeable batteries back in the 1880s. When was the first TV set invented? The Baird televisor, released in 1928, is considered the first commercially available television set. It was a mechanical television using a spinning disc to scan and transmit images. While the image quality was low, it was the first of its kind available to the public. And here's the screen over here. Now, this wasn't broadcast TV. First of all, there were no TV stations in 1928. It had this big disc, and this disc would spin around, and you would see the images over here. I would call this more of a disc player with a viewer built onto it, but history calls it the first TV. What was the first personal computer? The first commercially successful personal computer was the Altair 8800, which was released in a kit form in 1975. So you got it, and it was all in pieces, and you had to be smart enough to know how to build the thing. It had no keyboard. It had no monitor. It had no program. You had to do all of that yourself. When was the bicycle invented? The first bicycle, a 2-wheeled human-propelled machine, was the velocipede, invented by Carl von Drais around 1817. This hobby horse or dandy horse was steered by the rider using a handlebar and propelled by pushing off of the ground with their feet. In other words, didn't have any gears or pedals. You just had to basically run with it while seated. When was the first gun invented? How old are guns? The earliest firearm known as a fire lances originated in China during the 10th century. These consisted of a bamboo or a metal tube filled with gunpowder attached to a spear. When ignited, the gunpowder propelled flames and sometimes shrapnel or pellets, acting as a flamethrower and a short-range projectile weapon. 10th century. When was the electric refrigerator invented? As a very young boy, we had a refrigerator, but we had to have the iceman come several times a week, and we put ice in the top of it. We didn't have an electric refrigerator when I was little. The first electric refrigerator for home use was invented in 1913 by Fred W. Wolf Jr. and was called the Domelier. While it was the first, it wasn't initially a commercial success. When was the telephone invented? The first telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell, and the first successful telephone call was made on March 10, 1876 in Boston. Bell's famous words, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." That was the first message ever sent over this device, the telephone. As a child, I played with my erector set. When was that first introduced? The first erector set was introduced by A.G. Gilbert in 1913. It was initially called the Misto Erector Structural Steel Builder, but became known as the erector set. My sister had a doll that said, "Mama." When was the first talking doll introduced? Edison's phonograph doll is a children's toy doll developed by the Edison Phonograph Toy Manufacturers Company, and it was introduced in 1890. And here you can see the holes for the speaker. So this was the first talking doll, 1890. I used to play with a slinky. When was that introduced? The slinky was invented in 1943 by Richard James, a naval engineer working on a project to stabilize sensitive instruments on ships. He accidentally knocked a spring off a shelf, and upon seeing it walk down instead of falling, he realized its potential as a toy. His wife Betty named it Slinky. The Slinky was first publicly demonstrated and sold at the Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia in November of 1945, right at the end of World War II. So I would have been 1 year old in 1945. In the 1970s, my daughter played with lots of Barbie dolls. When was the Barbie doll introduced? The first Barbie doll made her debut on March 9, 1959 at the American International Toy Fair in New York City. She was introduced by Mattel and created by Ruth Handler. The doll was initially available as either a blonde or brunette and wore a black and white zebra-striped swimsuit with a signature top-knot ponytail. Little boys used to play with G.I. Joe dolls. When were they first introduced? G.I. Joe debuted in 1964 as a line of 12-inch action figures representing different branches of the U.S. military: action soldier, action sailor, action pilot, and action marine. The term action figure is said to have originated with G.I. Joe. I mean, boys didn't want to be accused of playing with dolls, so instead of calling these dolls, they called them action figures. I used to shave with a safety razor. When was that invented? The first disposable safety razor was invented by King Camp Gillette and William Emery Nickerson in 1901. They patented the design, which included a thin stamped steel blade that could be replaced when dull, making shaving far more convenient and safer than using a straight razor. My grandfather always shaved with a straight razor. It used to scare me to death. I used to sleep under an electric blanket until I moved to Florida. When was the electric blanket invented? Sidney I. Russell is credited with creating the first electric blanket in 1912. These early models were bulky and primarily used in hospitals and tuberculosis sanitariums to keep patients warm. I mean, look at this gizmo and all these big heavy cables. I've played the piano for 72 years now. When was the piano invented? The piano was invented in the 1700 by Bartolomeo Cristofori of Italy. He was unsatisfied by the lack of control that musicians had over the volume level of the harpsichord. He is credited for switching out of the plucking mechanisms. That's the way a harpsichord, when you hit the keys, it plucks the strings. So he changed that over to a hammer to create the modern piano. I've played the guitar for years. When was the first guitar invented? The earliest documented plucked string instrument resembling a guitar appeared in Spain around the 15th century, called the vihuela. It had 4 double coarse strings. In other words, it was an 8-stringed instrument. I used to play a 12-string guitar, so I have an idea of what it was like to play this thing. I got my first electric guitar in 1960 when I was 16. When was the electric guitar invented? By the way, this is me on the left. The first commercially successful electric guitar was the Rickenbacker A22 Electro Hawaiian, also known as the frying pan, and it was introduced in 1931. It was designed by George Beauchamp and Paul Barth, and it featured a magnetic pickup to amplify the string vibrations, which is exactly what my electric guitar did. It had a pickup. When was the photographic camera introduced? Joseph Niepce created the first photographic camera in 1816. He used a process called heliography, which involved coating a metal or glass plate with a light-sensitive substance and exposing it to light. Can you imagine lugging this thing around? When was the first motion picture camera invented? The first motion picture camera, known as the kinetograph, was invented by Thomas Edison and his assistant William Dickinson in 1890. Look at this monstrosity. I mean, 2 men could barely pick it up. It sure ain't no iPhone. I was a senior executive at Apple Computer, that was our name originally, for over 30 years, and we introduced our Quick Take digital camera in 1994. When was the first digital camera invented? The first digital camera was invented by Stephen Sasson, who was an engineer at Eastman Kodak, in 1975. This camera captured black and white images at a very low resolution, and it stored them on a cassette tape. Can you imagine? Here it is. Here's the cassette tape. This is the whole camera. Once again, can you imagine lugging that thing around? I mean, our smartphones are so convenient compared to this. 1975, that's when the digital cameras all started. During my 30 years with Apple, we introduced a number of printers. When was the inkjet printer first introduced? Because that's what most people have in their home, either that or a laser. The Hewlett-Packard 2225 ThinkJet printer was introduced in 1984. That's the year we introduced the Macintosh computer at Apple, 1984. At Apple, we introduced a 5 megabyte hard disk in 1985. When was the first hard disk invented? Okay. The world's first commercial hard disk was the IBM 350 disk file, introduced in 1956. This revolutionary storage device, while massive, here it is. It is the size and weight of 2 refrigerators. This is a lift truck, and they're lifting this thing up to put it into an airplane. This was the first hard disk drive, my friends, and it only held 5 megabytes. So it stored the data on 50 24-inch platters. So here are 24 of these, 50 of these 24-inch diskettes or disk. And it had 5 megabytes. And in today's dollars, this thing sold for $300,000 for a 5 megabyte disk drive. And now you can buy a thumb drive, for 10 gigabytes for $4 or something like that. We've come a long way. Over the years, I've bought dozens of thumb drives. When was the thumb drive invented? The first USB flash drive, known as the disk-on-key, was introduced by the Israeli company M Systems in 1999, not that long ago, and it became available in the next year, in the year 2000. It offered 8 megabyte of storage, which was a significant advantage over the then dominant floppy disk. The 3.5-inch floppies could only hold 750 megabytes, 750K of storage. So this was a lot bigger and a lot more handy. We all use web browsers every day. When was the web browser invented? Mosaic, released in 1993, is widely recognized as the first popular and widely used web browser. It was developed by a team at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And Lord, do I remember using Mosaic. We all use search engines, usually Google. When was the first search engine invented? The first internet search engine was Archie, created in 1990 at McGill University. Used this a lot. I wear headphones when I play and record my keyboard. When were headphones invented? Headphones were invented in 1910 by Nathaniel Baldwin. And this is what they looked like. I moved from Florida to Indiana and I had to buy a snowblower. When was the snowblower invented? The home snowblower was introduced in 1925 by Arthur Sicard. It doesn't look that much different than modern snowblowers. I mow my lawn every week in the summertime. When was the gas lawnmower introduced? The gas lawnmower was introduced in 1830 by Englishman Edwin Budding. Look at this monster. I use a string trimmer to trim my lawn. When was the lawn trimmer introduced? In 1971, George Ballas introduced his new product, the Weed Eater. Got one of those. For years, I bought music CDs. When was the compact disc invented? The first compact disc was invented in 1966 by James T. Russell. Every day I go to hundreds of different websites. What was the very first website? The very first website was created by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN and launched on August 6, 1991. It was dedicated to the World Wide Web project, and it explained how the web worked, how to create a web page, and how to set up a web browser. The address of the first website was http://info.cern.ch/. And by the way, it's still up and running, and you can go there and see it yourself. When I first joined Apple Computer back in 1981, we used 5 1/4-inch floppy disk with our Apple II computer. That disk only held 400K. When was the floppy disk invented, the 5 1/4? The first 5 1/4-inch floppy disk was developed by Shugart Associates in 1976. I've played synthesizers and digital keyboards for almost 50 years now. When was the synthesizer first invented? The first commercial synthesizer was the Moog synthesizer, invented by Robert Moog in 1964. It was a modular system with components that allowed for creating a wide variety of sounds by controlling voltage. When and where was the first record recording studio? The world's first purpose-built recording studio was EMI Studios, now known as Abbey Road Studios. It opened on November 12, 1931 in London, England. And this is where the Beatles also recorded. I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s playing 45 RPM records that cost me $1. When was the 45 RPM record first introduced? The first 45 RPM record released was Pee-wee the Piccolo. The Piccolo. Start over. Pee-wee the Piccolo by RCA Victor, and it was pressed on December 7th, 1948. I was 4 years old at the time. For years, we've always had a microwave oven in the kitchen. When was the microwave first introduced? The first microwave oven designed for household use was the Tappan RL-1, introduced in 1955. It was large, 220 volts wall unit that retailed for $1,295. That would be $14,800 in today's dollars. So that's a very expensive microwave. And 220 volt. So you had to have a special outlet just to plug the thing in. My daughter used to love to play with Lego. When were they invented? Lego began in 1932 in the carpentry workshop of Ole Kirk Christensen, a Danish furniture maker. During the Great Depression, he began to make miniature versions of his products, which inspired him to produce those toys. I have loved Disney movies all my life. What was the first Disney cartoon? Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was the first creation of Walt Disney after he opened his animation studio in 1923. When did Mickey Mouse first appear in a cartoon? The first Mickey Mouse cartoon movie is Steamboat Willie, which premiered on December 18, 1928. It was the first cartoon to feature synchronized sound, and it introduced Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse to the world. What was the first full-length animated movie? The first full-length animated movie is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, produced by Walt Disney Productions, which premiered in 1937. What is the oldest silent movie still viewable? The oldest surviving silent film is Roundhay Garden Scene, filmed by Louis Laprince in 1888. This short film, lasting only about 3 seconds, captures a brief moment of people walking in a garden. I grew up loving to go to scary horror movies. What was the first horror movie? The first horror film is generally considered to be Le Manoir du Diablo, also known as The House of the Devil, a French film shot in 1896. And you can go on YouTube and find this thing. I'm just going to show you a few seconds of it. You know, it's not really that scary. What they were really showing off was their special effects, as hokey as it is. So let's watch just a few seconds of the beginning of this thing. So here's a bat, kind of a cheesy looking bat. And all of a sudden, poof, he changes into a man. Oh, amazing. The audiences must have been amazed. And now, poof, and there's a big kettle. Now remember, audiences had never seen anything like this. Poof, oh my goodness, a man appears right out of a puff of smoke. And now he waves his hand and poof, a man or woman, I'm not sure what it is, Okay, you get the idea. The house of the devil. Every morning I use my electric toothbrush. When was that invented? The first electric toothbrush was introduced by Tomlinson Moseley on December 13th, 1937. So things been around for quite a while. But look how big and awkward this thing looks. I use an electric shaver every morning. When was that first introduced? The electric shaver was introduced in 1921 by Jacob Schnick. I find this amazing because my grandfather never used an electric razor, and my father never used an electric razor. So thanks for watching. I hope you had some fun, and I hope you learned something new. Be well.